Okay, so we are moving through the class. We are now talking about the founding of the American government. This is basically going to be a two-part class because there's a lot of things to cover. I also want to talk a little bit about the origins of capitalism because I think that's a very important thing to understand in relation to the origins of the American government. So there are some, critical things that I'm going to say. However, let's just get it out of the way right at the start. I mean, the American Revolution is an incredibly important event, not only in American history, of course, but really in world history as well, in human history, in other words. The American Republic was founded at a time where, most of the world was basically ruled by, kings and queens and, inherited power, basically. So the idea of a government where people vote for and elect their representatives and leaders was definitely a major uh, progressive step forward, again, in human history as well. So we should understand that. We should also understand, again, I think it's important to talk about the origins of capitalism as well, because capitalism as an economic system was sort of coming into being pretty much around the same time as the American government was forming. And I think both processes are deeply connected with each other. I think it's also worth pointing out that the American government and American society today is arguably among the most capitalist in the world. You could pretty much argue, I think, accurately that all societies are pretty much capitalist in some way. I'll try to cover some of the structural features of that to make that make a little bit more sense as we're going through this. Even a lot of the countries that can be considered or that consider themselves to be socialist. I think if you look at their economic structure, actually, this is somewhat of a controversial claim, more accurately resemble capitalism in many ways. However, many other societies do try to put maybe some kind of restraint or inhibit in some ways the dynamics of a capitalist system from fully operating to some extent. And again, I'll try to cover what some of these dynamics are in a moment. But again, I think you can make a pretty good argument that American society is one of the sort of the least inhibited societies as far as how the operations of a capitalist system are supposed to work. And I think it's important to understand that in historical context as well as in the present today. So I'm going to spend some time talking about that. Um, to sort of guide me along in a very sort of basic overview of how capitalism. I am relying on this book here by Chris Harman, Zombie Capitalism. Now, first of all, let's just point out, the cover here. This is actually the cover to the book. This is a pretty tremendous cover. I guess it sort of fits well in talking about in the context of talking about the origins of the American government as well. Here you can see a zombified picture of George Washington here on the cover of the book. I did include this book as a recommended reading among the other readings for the course. I would recommend people read that. What I'm going to try to do is briefly summarize the first three chapters of the book, which I think are very good for giving you a kind of broad overview of Marx's theory and how Marx understands capitalism. I'm mostly going to skip over chapter two. You'll see I've provided slides on the PowerPoint if you do want to read them. I'll mostly skip over those and try to summarize chapter one mostly and briefly summarize chapter three as well. So let me switch back over to my PowerPoint. Um, okay, so capitalism can be defined most basically by the predominance of commodities, right? So what that means basically is that modern economic life, again, as it says here, is centered on buying and selling goods. Buying and selling, pretty much constitutes the dominant activity in society today. Basic needs like food, housing, clothing, energy, transportation must be purchased. Again, some countries do sort of take these things out of the market. Some societies do try to commodify these things, as the term is used. American society definitely does not, for the most part, at least. And other societies, still, even if they try to commodify these things a little bit, are still to some extent, bound by the pressures of producing these things as commodities. To be able to buy things, including the basic necessities of life, people must sell. And what do you have to sell? For many people, they really have nothing else to sell other than essentially themselves, or more accurately, their ability to work. So you're essentially selling your labor power in exchange for a wage, which you then use that wage to then buy uh, to purchase goods. Survival depends on the circulation of commodities. So commodities circulate around. Things are produced in one area, then shipped to another area, and people buy them in that area, and so forth. And so modern day life is sort of comprised by this immense circulation of commodities. This is basically Marx's starting point in Capital Volume 1. Capital's wealth appears in an immense accumulation of commodities, as it says here. Marx also talks about the commodity form as being sort of like the cellular form of capitalism. If you think of capitalism as an organism, then the commodities are basically the cells that make up the organism. Now, a society defined by commodity production, again, buying and selling goods and services that we need to survive, hasn't always existed. And I think it's an important thing. Many people, I guess, sort of take that for granted that that's the way societies have always been run. But really, there is a very sort of specific point in which commodity production comes into existence, and especially when commodity production becomes, once again, the dominant activity of life, where basically all other aspects of social life are more or less subordinated to the production of commodities. Even in Marx's time, many societies were not fully market-based. And in earlier times, you have so-called hunter-gatherer societies. You have so-called primitive communist societies that produce for direct need. Peasant societies under feudalism produced mostly for their own subsistence. In other words, they did not produce for the market to be exchanged on the market. Even where markets existed, most people produced what they consumed. Today, of course, commodity production is nearly universal, really stretching over almost every corner of the world, in fact. Even things that were formerly outside of the domain of commodity production, as we've already said, healthcare and education are increasingly commodified as well. This universality of commodities is historically unprecedented. This has not always existed. And even, again, in the early phases of capitalism, there were still many aspects of life that did not fully fall under commodity production. Nowadays, in the world that we've been living in, and has, even pre-existed us by a certain stretch of time, this has now become, the norm, where commodity production basically covers everything. So to understand capitalism, you basically have to understand how commodities are produced. So Marx built on earlier thinkers who also analyzed emerging capitalism. Classic political economists defended capitalism against feudal landowners. Key figures, Adam Smith, who, incidentally, his important book, The Wealth of Nations, was published in 1776. That should be a very significant year, of course, for students of American history as well. So again, you can see a direct connection here between the early economists, the so-called classical economists, or classical political economy, as it was known then, emerging out of the late 18th century, and the emergence of the American government as well. These two things, in many ways, directly paralleled each other. And Marx is very much building upon these thinkers as well. So you have Adam Smith, you have David Ricardo. These were advocates of industry and production and productivity. They wanted to see more things produced. For Adam Smith, that is what the wealth of nations is. The wealth of nations is not just, or wealth is not just, a store of money that you stash away somewhere. It is the ability to produce things and to use those things, in a way that is beneficial for yourself. When we get to it later on, we'll talk about how, modern day capitalism is sort of giving away from a system based around industrial production to one that's more based on finance, where financial spectrum. I've already talked about this a little bit. The dominance of the so-called FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. The rise of monopolies. Um, Even those that do, produce goods are increasingly becoming monopolized, especially in the technology field. Interestingly enough, Smith, especially, and Ricardo were opposed to those things. They did not like financial interests draining away productive investment. They did not like monopolists and monopolies, because they saw both of those things, monopolies and finances, being sort of a drain away from a productive investment, um, and tended to, especially in the case of monopolies, tended to, undermine competition, which of course they thought was very much a beneficial thing for producing, the goods and services that people need. It's interesting because people still like to sort of invoke these thinkers as defenders of the modern day status quo, but I would argue that they would be very critical of modern day finance capitalism, as it's known as. Anyway, so Smith distinguished two kinds of value in commodities. So again, here Marx is building upon Smith. Use value, the utility or usefulness of an object, and exchange value, the ability, the power to purchase other goods. If I have a certain commodity, how much of that commodity can I exchange for another commodity, basically. Use value and exchange value often diverge. So something that is useful might have a low exchange value, like water, for example. Or the opposite case would be a diamond, which has a low use value. There's not very much you can do with it, but has a very high exchange value. Now, Marx took this idea and developed it more. A use value is derived from a commodity's physical properties. It exists only in the commodity itself. It is independent of the amount of labor required. So the usefulness of the thing is the sort of, the intrinsic quality of it. It is not sort of influenced by how much its value is not influenced by how much labor it takes to produce it, only by its usefulness, basically. Exchange value, however, is a different thing. It's expressed as a quantitative relations between commodities, a numerical quantity, in other words. It changes with time and place. It is not a static relationship also. So commodities have the properties of both. They are both use values and bearers of exchange value as well. And understanding the relationship between these two things is very important. So neoclassical economics, which is kind of like mainstream economics, tends to reduce value to the subjective, what they call marginal utility. And Harman does talk at length, especially in chapter 2, about critics of Marx. I provided the slides there if you want to read it, or if you want to read the chapter in the book. Mostly going to skip over that, but suffice to say, I think that many of the criticisms of Marx kind of fall short. How do you measure the marginal utility of a thing if it's a subjective thing? Basically, whatever personal value I attach to a thing is supposed to somehow determine its market value. But how do you really measure something like that? It's very hard to define. Another school of economics, known as Sraffian economics, after the economist Piero Sraffa, focuses on physical inputs and outputs. In other words, they focus on use values, but not on exchange value. Some Marxists dismiss the distinction in favor of a narrow focus on exploitation. All these approaches, again, this is Harman here, miss something essential to capitalism. So what is that? So there are two sets of laws, he says, that govern capitalism. Commodity production is governed by two different logics. One, again, the laws of use value, determined by physics, chemistry, biology, and material constraints. These are what shape production. techniques, the physical structure of goods and infrastructure, the usefulness to consumers. Once again, we're focused on the real sort of tangible physical qualities of these things. But then you also have the laws of exchange value, which exists through market relations as well. Governs how commodities relate through prices and money. Exchange values can change independently of use values. So even though a commodity has both a use value and an exchange value, they're not in sync. And in fact, there's very much a kind of contradiction or sort of inner tension between these two things, which is really a development that Marx kind of pioneered, and is very sort of important to understand how his overall theories of capitalism develop as well. So again, exchange value can change independently of a use value. Harman uses the example of a computer. The exchange value of a computer changes, while its use value basically stays the same. Exchange values are infinitely divisible and abstracted from physical form. So they exist purely in a sort of quantitative sense, not in the again the physical qualities of the object itself. Use values are often indivisible, as he says. A factory, a hospital, or aircraft must function as a whole. You can't sort of break it up into pieces and then still expect it to function. In other words, exchange values, on the other hand, can be divided endlessly into monetary units. So normally, of course, exchange value is measured in terms of money. Markets treat physical things as divisible sums of money. This creates tension between physical reality and market logic. So again, there's a kind of tension or a contradiction between these things. Exchange values, money, in other words, can move rapidly across sectors and borders, even national borders, of course. Use values are physically fixed and slow to move. Capital can shift instantly. Factories and infrastructure cannot. It's very important for understanding things like outsourcing in our modern day world. This mismatch creates instability in capitalist production. There's a contradiction at the core of capitalism. Use values and exchange values follow different, often conflicting logics. Capitalism does not function as a smooth equilibrium system. Physical constraints interrupt the flow of exchange values. Crises arise from the embodiment of abstract values in material forms. Failure to grasp this duality leads to misunderstanding capitalism itself. So again, at the very heart of the commodity form, which Marx argues you can then sort of extrapolate to really understand capitalism itself, there's a tension between the use value of a thing, the actual physical qualities that the thing has, and essentially its exchange value or basically its monetary value. How much of that commodity can be exchanged for money in the market? Now, I don't want to get too much ahead of myself here, but already, there's a question of how essential are markets to the functioning of capitalism. Can you have examples where, the government, the state, essentially regulates a capitalist system, even in the absence of markets, or sort of minimizes the role of markets? That's a very, controversial point, and something that a lot of people, especially Marxist theorists, discuss to this very day. However, I think it is possible to, imagine a system where capitalist relations still take place. I haven't really gotten into that yet, though, the relationship between workers and capitalists, and workers and the so-called means of production. But I think it is possible to imagine a system, even again, like as I mentioned a moment ago, even in systems that consider themselves to be socialist, where the government essentially plays the role of a big capitalist, or the collective capitalist, as some people call it, and sort of regulates production, even in the absence of sort of the normal mechanisms of the market. And we should also remember, of course, that all these socialist countries that exist, there's not that many, of course, still have to exist within the world market as well. So even if they're internally regulated by the state, they still have to sort of compete upon the world market as well, and are still sort of subject to the logic of the market. So I don't want to get too much into the various debates that surround Marx theory, because we can easily go down a rabbit hole talking about those things. However, that is a very important thing to question. That is a very sort of ongoing debate. How essential are markets actually to the operation of a capitalist system? Can you have capitalism in the absence of markets? Anyway, labor as a source of exchange value. So this is the so-called the famous labor theory of value, which is often identified with Marx. But here again, Marx is building on Smith and Ricardo. Just as Marx did not, originate the distinction between use value and exchange value, Marx did not originate the so-called labor theory of value as well, which is that the exchange value of a commodity basically depends upon the amount of labor that goes into it. So again, Smith and Ricardo argued that commodities share a common element, human labor. Exchange values exist despite vast physical differences between commodities. Labor makes commodities commensurable. In other words, if you have, what is the example Marx uses? A yard of linen and then a certain quantity of wheat, or you have a loaf of bread and you have a can of soda or something like that. What is it that makes a exchange between these things possible, right? These are, in terms of use value, two completely distinct things. How could you compare them? How could you determine how many quantities of one good equals another quantity of another good? You really can't, except by comparing the common element that these things have, which they're both products of labor. So the ability to sort of establish an equivalency between the two, again, the Marx did not invent this idea, is based upon the amount of labor that goes into those things, the amount of time essentially it takes to produce these things. Establishes a sort of comparison that you can make to the point that you can say that a certain quantity of one good is equal to a certain quantity of another good. It's not a one-to-one thing. It may be, whatever, the 2 cans of soda equals, a loaf of bread or something like that. But what is the underlying relationship that makes you able to say that? According to them, again, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, it is the amount of labor that goes into these things. Now, Marx, of course, did sort of, develop and sort of, adapt the labor theory of value as well. Some would argue he improved upon it. So again, Smith's labor theory of value says that the real price of a commodity is the labor required to acquire it. What commodities can command in exchange is measured by the labor they can save or impose. Money purchases labor just as direct toil does, meaning, working on the thing yourself. Labor predates money as the measure of value. So value can be measured by the amount of labor hours that go into creating something, as well as a monetary value. Gold and silver, this is again Smith talking, gold and silver do not create value, labor does. Marx takes this idea and adapts it. Marx agreed that exchange values must be reducible to a common substance. This substance cannot be a natural or physical property. The only shared property of commodities is that they are products of labor, once again. So Marx introduced the idea of socially necessary labor time. Value is not determined by the individual efforts or efficiency or inefficiencies of the worker. More idle or unskilled labor does not create more value. So, in other words, if it takes you twice as long to produce something, it doesn't mean that product has more value to it. Some people point that out as like an objection, but it's a very sort of easy thing to dispense with. Although arguably, Smith does sort of open himself up to that more than Marx, who was able to sort of correct this. Exchange value actually depends on socially necessary labor time, the labor required under average conditions, using average skill and intensity at a given time. So it sort of sets a sort of social average it takes to produce something, and the value of the commodity then relates to that social average. Not what the individual person does, but what would take under normal circumstances the amount of time it takes to produce those things. Now, Marx also introduces a separation between concrete labor and abstract labor. So concrete labor is the specific activities in which a person is doing. A baker is baking bread, a tailor is making clothing, things like that. Those refer to concrete labors. And those also obviously correspond much more to the use value of the commodity. But Marx is saying that it's not concrete labor that determines the value of the commodity either. It's abstract labor, which becomes a proportion of the total social labor. So another important thing is that Marx is looking at social labor in a total sense. social labor performed throughout society as a whole, not just the individual person. Understanding how Marx sort of moves between the individual level and sort of the total level, the totality, is a very important thing to understand um, as well. Abstract labor, he says, is the substance of value. Now, a lot of people, this is another important debate that a lot of people have, and one which I, really can't go into that much. But what is abstract labor? Is it actual material force? Marx calls it the substance of value. So that would seem to suggest yes. However, some people would say that abstract labor is an immaterial thing. So, for example, the theorist David Harvey, the very influential theorist, argues that abstract labor is immaterial. He says it's immaterial but objective at the same time. Other Marxist theorists like Guillermo Carcetti, for example, I think Harman also follows along in this as well, argues that no, abstract labor actually is a material force. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not a material force. Just like a gravity is a material force, even though you cannot see it. So people often make that a fallacy that because you cannot see abstract labor, it is not a material substance. But they argue that it is. Probably the easiest way to understand it is that it is sort of an expenditure of human energy. Doesn't matter necessarily what you're doing. Doesn't matter if you're baking bread or making clothes or programming a computer or anything like that. It's the expenditure of energy, the expenditure of human energy making things. That is what gives the value to a commodity. And that's it. It's just that sort of raw, undifferentiated expenditure of energy. It's a very important thing to understand because a lot of people seem to go wrong on this. Not to get too much into it, but if you follow Harvey's approach and other theorists and argue the value is an immaterial thing, then you come closer to the idea of saying that, well, value is sort of like a socially constructed concept. It's not really real. It's just sort of a value that society sort of, bestows upon these things. But that seems to, depart to a significant extent from Marx. For one, it seems to undermine the idea that the value of a commodity is created during the process of production. And it seems to, pretty much directly contradict what Marx is saying is that, again, value is, or I'm sorry, abstract labor is a material substance that is actually, imparted into the commodity itself. Anyway, very confusing debate. Some people regard this as the most sort of dense debate within Marxist theory. So I don't want to say too much on it, but it is an interesting thing to talk about. So again, exchange value expresses how much social labor a commodity embodies. This leads to another concept known as the law of value. Society's total labor is distributed through market exchange. So the total labor, imagine if you could, add up and the total amount of hours that people work in the economy over a given year. You kind of can to some extent. I mean, they do keep statistics on work hours and things like that. So imagine the total amount of hours that people spend working in the economy over a year, and then how this labor is distributed through market exchange. How the value that which is created through this labor is then distributed through market exchange. Producers are compelled to align their labor with social needs. Market exchange enforces this alignment blindly and indirectly. Marx calls this process the law of value. Now, again, this goes to another thing, and I realize I'm breaking my rules by sort of engaging in some of these debates here. But it leads to this question of, well, once again, how necessary is market exchange for capitalism to function? Can you have capitalism without market exchange? You probably can, although it's certainly not the typical form of capitalism. This would then be something which some theorists have called state capitalism, where again, the sort of state takes on the process of sort of regulating the distribution of goods throughout society. But again, when we're talking about market exchange, we are talking about not necessarily the production of goods, but the distribution of goods, which can be considered to be two separate things. Well, obviously they interrelate to each other as well. You're only going to produce things if you feel that they have a good chance of being distributed and sold. It also gestures towards how surplus value, which I haven't really gotten to yet, But the sort of extra value created by the workers are distributed throughout society as well. Once again, you have to move from the individual level to the total level, or maybe just always stay at the total level. And when Marx talks about this, he's talking about value produced in a total sense. But the people that produce that value, not just the workers, but the capitalists that appropriate that value created by the workers, oftentimes aren't able to hold on to all that value themselves. They, in fact, have to give up some of the value that they get out of their workers to other capitalists. Yeah, it's a very important thing for understanding, for example, how international trade works uh, today, for example. But again, that's another sort of higher level debate that I won't get into too much. There's important a distinction you have to understand between the value of a commodity and the price of a commodity. These things don't always correspond exactly, although I think modern research tends to show you there's not a significant deviation between these two things as well. Again, the value of a commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time which goes into it. The price of a commodity refers to how much it could be sold for in the market. And the price of a commodity doesn't always have to correspond to the value of a commodity. Value sets the center, however, around which market prices fluctuate. So the market price of a commodity can be above its value, can be below its value. But it sort of sets what some people call a center of gravity under which the actual price of a commodity tends to fluctuate around. So it sort of sets boundaries, in other words, for how far the price of a commodity can deviate from. Again, it's another important thing because people often think that this is a weakness in Marxist theory, but he seems to not only provide a pretty good explanation of it, but really anticipate a lot of the criticisms that people make and sort of diffuses them before they have a chance to even make them. Well, they still make them anyway. Value becomes visible only through market interaction. So once again, you can't see the value of a commodity. It can only be realized through market exchange, although there may be other ways to sort of realize that value as well. Individual producers are disciplined by competition. And what we mean by this is that, some producers, some capitalists have to set their prices, again, below their value in order to compete with other capitalists. Because this is just sort of common sense, right? I mean, people are looking for the lower price. So if you can sell your thing for a lower price, people are going to tend to buy that more. So if you're producing something at a higher value and want a higher price, you may be forced to lower your price in order to compete with other capitalists. And oddly enough, this, Marx would argue, leads to other capitalists being able to, again, essentially sort of suck up value produced by workers working for other capitalists and value appropriated by other capitalists as well. Values are not fixed. New technologies reduce socially necessary labor time. When required labor falls, exchange value falls. So again, when the amount of hours that it takes to produce something falls, the exchange value of the commodity is going to fall as well. Use value, of course, is not unchanged by that, unless, of course, the product itself, falls apart. Value decline is systemic, he says, not a subjective thing. So the long-term fall in the value of commodities is basically something that's more or less baked into the system itself. Another important thing to understand. Increased productivity lowers the value of commodities. This conclusion, Harman argues, is counterintuitive but empirically observable. Marx's example, power looms used for manufacturing textiles have the labor needed to weave cloth. Hand loom weavers' output lost half its value. So even if you were not using a mechanical loom or a power loom, if you're still doing it by hand, your product now has basically just lost half of its value, whether or not you're using it or not. So that's one way in which this process works, and how it sort of exercises control over other people, even if you're not directly involved in it yourself. And of course, that's going to create pressure on the person to adopt that technology as well. Today, high-tech industries reduce prices of electronics. Sectors with slower technical change see stable or rising prices. Again, rising prices is not good because you're going to be put out of business basically by people that can sell their product for cheaper. This uneven productivity is central to modern capitalist dynamics as well. It's also essential to what Marx will later call the law of the falling rate of profit, or the tendential fall, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. As capitalism increases its productivity, it actually undermines its profitability. Very important thing to understand as well. Yet again, this is another area where there is significant disagreement, even among Marxist theorists. Money as universal equivalent. One commodity comes to represent the value of all others. Money, historically, gold or silver serve this role. Its value is tied to labor required to produce it. Paper money, as we know, zombified George Washington, for example, later replaced gold in circulation. Fiat money functions through social trust. It's basically backed up by the government, and that's it. It's not backed up by any supply of gold, which you can sort of exchange paper money for gold. Bank credit also operates as money when confidence holds. A lot of our money, Harmer doesn't really go into it, but a lot of the so-called money supply isn't even backed by paper money. It simply exists as electronic credits, just numbers on a screen, basically. And it can function as long as people believe that it functions, essentially, as long as people believe that this is, a trustworthy transaction, essentially. And of course, it's easy to understand why money becomes a universal equivalent. I mean, would you really want to, barter and trade for everything that you have? I mean, imagine people using, cows as a means of exchange. That means every time you want to buy something, you'd have to exchange a certain amount of cows to get, food or, whatever else you need. It's obviously not a practical thing to do. So money simply becomes the most, convenient way to sort of, facilitate exchange. Commodity fetishism, as Marx calls it, grows out of this. Now, the word fetishism has a different meaning from what we would normally understand it today. Thank, I guess, maybe Sigmund Freud for that, or other psychologists. But there's no real sexual connotation to it. Fetishism means something like more in lines of sort of like an object of worship, essentially. But Marx does introduce this term commodity fetishism as well, also in volume 1 of Capital. Commodity production distorts our perception of social relations between people. Relations between people appear as relations between things. Now, what does that mean? When we go to the supermarket, we buy food and things like that, and it's very easy to forget that somebody else made those things that we are buying. We don't relate to those people that are buying those things. We relate to the thing, the price of the thing, the quality of the thing. That's all we really care about. Think about in terms of clothing and other, goods that are produced in sweatshops. Many times, not even, probably most of the time, not even in this country. We do have somewhat of an awareness of it, right? People are becoming somewhat more aware of those things, but like I said, it's still very easy for people to kind of forget about those things. And again, you tend to relate more directly to the thing itself and kind of forget about the people that produce those things. And the sort of forgetting, or the sort of distorted perception that comes out of that, is what Marx calls fetishism. We sort of give the object almost a life of its own, rather than forgetting it is basically just a social product. Products of labor seem to have an independent power. Money appears powerful in itself rather than as stored labor. Marx refers to this as sort of the perfected form of fetishism, that money itself sort of becomes, the end all and be all of everything. The root of all evil, as some people call it. The market appears as an autonomous force, right? We get locked into this way of thinking. And it's not just a way of thinking. I mean, there are real things that are sort of, coercing us to feel as if, the market, the economy itself is just sort of this thing that operates by itself, and we are sort of subject to its power, basically. But the economy is nothing more than just the sort of sum total of people doing things, basically producing and selling goods, you know. So it's really us. We are the economy, even though it feels as if the economy is just sort of this sort of alien force that controls us. Social problems are attributed to impersonal forces, the market, again, the power of money. These mystifications obscure human agency. Marx called this alienation. Later, Marxists called it reification, literally like thingification, the process of turning social relations into things, or sort of, attributing life to sort of inanimate objects. Um, and of course, having a scientific understanding of this thing is not automatically going to change thing. It's nice to have knowledge of these things, but without any real action to back it up, nothing's really going to change. But it is, of course, important, at least as a very first step, to understand how these things work. So now we get to this idea of exploitation and surplus value. So modern commodity production is highly concentrated, of course. According to Harman in 2008, the world's 2,000 largest companies accounted for about half of global output. So 2,000 companies throughout the entire world make up about half of all the world's output in all the world. A tiny elite, tens of thousands at most, controls the bulk of global wealth creation. Tens of thousands of people might sound like a lot, but obviously it's not when you consider that we live in a world of billions of people. And so out of a world of billions of people, tens of thousands of people basically more or less, control the economy. And certainly, um, benefit the most from the buying and selling of goods. Board overlap further reduces the number of decision makers, according to Harman. And he's talking about people sitting on different, corporate boards of uh, boards of directors and things like that. Oftentimes you'll see same people sitting on the boards of several different corporations. So it's a very sort of tiny, again, a relatively tiny network of people that pretty much direct and control them. Not just commodity production in the United States, but throughout the entire world. And of course, if they're in control of production, it means that most of us are not. So we're not in control of what we do, and certainly not in control of how the goods and services produced in the world, how they're made, and how they circulate. And it's our sort of lack of control over these things that allows essentially these tiny elite, as he says, to sort of coerce us to produce things. And that is important. Thing to understand. Capitalism is a coercive system. As people are essentially forced to become workers and to produce things. And just because there's no overt, well, relatively little overt violence for the most part, doesn't mean that there's an absence of coercion. I think it's a very important thing to understand. I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. I think I have another slide that says that more. But we're always talking about we live in a free society and things like that. During the Cold War, we talked about the conflict between the free world and communism. So we love talking about how free we are in this country, but one of the most important points that Marx makes is that, well, capitalism is a very coercive system. And just because you don't see overt violence every single day doesn't mean that coercion still isn't being exercised upon people, which of course undermines the claim to freedom. If you're being coerced, then you're not free. Anyway, so a small minority owns and controls productive assets. The majority must sell their capacity to work to survive. Again, they're forced to. Workers receive wages in exchange for their labor. Their products of their labor do not belong to them, but belong to the owners of production. Surplus value is created through this process of workers receiving a wage and working for a capitalist. Value created in production is divided between wages for workers, cost of raw materials, depreciation of machinery and buildings, things losing their value over time. What remains is an excess. Marx calls this surplus value. Non-Marxist economists call it simply the surplus, although there's some Marxist economists that use that term as well. Usually when they're trying to, once again, defend so-called socialism in state capitalist countries. Surplus value is the basis of profit. And here's another thing people get hung up on. I don't think it's as important. I think this is where people are being a little more maybe anal or pedantic, but surplus value is not exactly the same thing as profit. Marx talks about it as a conversion. Surplus value is converted into profit, but basically profit comes from surplus value. And it's simply the extra amount of value that the capitalist gets to keep for themselves. So capitalists employ workers. Workers produce value through their abstract labor. But some of that value has to be paid back to the worker in their wage. Some of that value has to be then used to replace the costs of materials that they use in producing things. So some of that value gets deducted by the cost that the capitalist incurs, including paying for their workers. And that extra value, whatever is left over after deducting those costs, is basically surplus value. You can see how it very much relates to the idea of profit, which is basically what the capitalist has extra after deducting their expenses as well. Now, once again, Marx is guided by Smith, who's writing, literally around the same time in which the American government is being formed, by the way, if I hadn't said that enough already. In pre-capitalist society, workers kept the full value, the full product of their labor. With private ownership of land and tools, owners now claim a share of the product. Employers advance wages and materials. Profit comes from sharing in the value added by labor. Profit arises from ownership of productive assets, things that produce value. Ricardo's contribution. Ricardo clarified some of the inconsistencies of Smith. So Smith argued that profit and rent can create value. Ricardo clarified value is created by labor alone. After Ricardo's death, mainstream economics abandoned this view. The shift made capitalism easier to defend ideologically, meaning ideas needed to sort of rationalize or legitimize capitalism. And most people, some people would argue that there are reasons for that, of course, based in economic theory. But many people feel that the reason why later economists abandon the labor theory of value is because it tends to undermine capitalism, right? I mean, if workers are the ones actually creating the value through their labor alone, why is it that the capitalist gets to keep most of the product of that labor? So Marx accepted Ricardo's labor theory of value. He rejected the idea that profit creates value. He went further, however, in explaining how exploitation occurs. Labor versus labor power. Smith used value of labor in two different senses. Wages needed to sustain the worker, actual labor performed. Marx showed that these are not the same. Capitalists do not buy labor itself. They buy what he calls labor power, the capacity to work for a given time. This is very important in determining how wages are paid to a worker. So what is the value of labor power? Now, again, workers are commodified just like anything else in the capitalist system. And if that sounds like a dehumanizing thing, it is. From the point of view of the capitalist, from the point of view of the system of production, a worker is just any other commodity. Or more accurately, maybe their ability to work, their labor power is just like any other commodity. So how do we define the value of a commodity? By socially necessary labor time. So this now includes, somewhat oddly enough, what it takes to produce a worker. Well, how do you produce a worker? Well, a worker needs food, a worker needs a shelter, as it says here, includes food, clothing, housing, rest, and minimal leisure, reproduction of the workforce. So the wages that the worker receives are not tied to their actual labor, their concrete labor. The wages that a worker receives are tied to what it costs to sustain the worker and to reproduce the workforce over time. So what does a worker need to survive, at least for a period of time? That determines what their wages are. It's also shaped by historical and moral standards, workers' struggles as well. Marx rejected the idea of an iron law of wages. The wages tend to fall to the bare subsistence level. Marx understood that, different workers' struggles, different historical uh, standards will define what the value of labor power is. In other words, in a certain society, the value of labor power may be higher than another society. Not just in terms of subsistence costs, but what people would be considered to be, an adequate standard of living. And here again, there's a very interesting parallel between here and international trade, where the value of labor power in countries like the United States is, in fact, much higher than the value of labor power in many other countries, often referred to as the global south or the global periphery, where the value of labor power is much lower. And that was also due to, cost of living there, but also to worker struggles, past struggles, as well as historical standards. What people would consider to be an adequate standard of living in the United States is different than what people would consider an adequate standard of living in another country. But it's a very sort of open-ended process, and a very important thing to emphasize that, because it goes against this idea that people just like sort of blindly follow or sort of program by how the economy works. Marx actually introduces lots of open-endedness, lots of contingencies into things, which is a common criticism of Marx also, that everything's very sort of follows a very sort of rigid pattern. That is actually not true. If you actually read Marx, unfortunately, most of the people that criticize Marx don't seem to have ever actually read him. But anyway, so what the worker gets paid is not the value of their labor, but basically a calculation of what it costs to maintain that worker. Those are two different things. And because of that, labor power can create more value than it costs to reproduce. So, for example, in 4 hours, a worker may cover their subsistence. In other words, in 4 hours, they may produce enough value that equals what they get paid as a wage. But what happens? You don't just go home after 4 hours. You work another 4 to 6 hours. And that extra 4 to 6 hours basically is what Marx calls surplus labor, which then becomes or is the basis of surplus value. And let's be clear also, when he's talking about surplus value, he's essentially talking about unpaid labor. I mean, that's essentially what makes profit possible in a capitalist system. The worker is performing a certain amount of unpaid labor, which the capitalist then gets to keep for themselves. Well, there's a certain word we have to describe a laborer who is not compensated for their labor. And that essentially, I don't know if Marx invented the term wage slave, but he certainly used it a lot. And in his view, and in the view of a lot of other people, I mean, that is an accurate term to use. I mean, wage labor under capitalism is almost like being like a part-time slave. You are a slave for a part of the time, maybe not all of the time. And in many ways, the conditions of wage laborers in Marx's day, certainly, and again, in many cases in the global South or in sectors within the United States, which are mostly covered by migrant laborers, very tough, almost slave-like working conditions imposed upon people. But anyway, I mean, that is basically where profit comes from. It essentially comes from unpaid labor. Now, importantly, however, that uncompensated labor is concealed by the wage form, right? The wage that a capitalist pays to their employer appears as if it's an equal exchange. So much so that Marx even concedes that maybe even the capitalists themselves do not realize what they are actually doing. They may, in fact, honestly believe that they are giving, an equal, an honest wage, or whatever they call it, an honest day's work for an honest day's wage, or whatever that saying is. That they feel it is a free exchange between equals. I mean, even then, I find that hard to believe that there's not a tremendous, asymmetry of power between employer and employee. But some people might believe it. And again, even maybe many workers believe that as well, that the wage that they receive is fair and equitable to the amount of of work that they are being asked to do. But Marx is saying it's only basically, concealing the surplus labor that the worker is, forced to perform. No direct coercion is involved. It's completely compatible with legal equality and the so-called rights of man. These ideas very much, sort of enshrined within the foundations of the American government as well. And it is, of course, distinct from slavery or feudal serfdom. Now, again, like I said, Marx does use the term wage slave, but he does understand that there is a difference between a wage laborer and a slave. I think the term wage slave is more of a rhetorical device rather than an analytically, precise concept. Marx was not above, sort of using strong language and going down that path as well. But it is important to analyze the distinction between wage labor from slavery and from serfdom. Even though, again, the conditions imposed upon wage laborers oftentimes can be as tough as conditions imposed upon these other forms of labor as well. The important thing, though, is that the coerciveness, the exploitation is concealed by the form of the wage that they receive. Of course, there is an underlying inequality in this, though. Right? Employers own the means of production. Workers are free to choose employers, but they're not free to so-called exit the capitalist class relationship. They have to work for somebody. Workers belong to the capitalist class as a whole, not individual employers. So here again, because you may not see overt coercion or overt force being used upon workers. Of course you do, by the way, when workers go on strike and rebel in some ways, but those things are relatively rare. We're talking like day-to-day life. You don't see those things that often. But just because there's an absence of overt force being used doesn't mean that the coerciveness, the lack of freedom, isn't still there. It is. Distribution of surplus value. Surplus value may appear as profit, interest, or rent. So surplus value, some of it is kept by the capitalist. The capitalist, in many ways, is oftentimes then forced to give up some of their profit to bankers in the forms of interest payments, to landlords in the form of rent. In many cases, bankers and landlords can divert so much profit away from the capitalist that it actually undermines, the further growth of production. But we shouldn't also forget, especially in modern day times, that bankers and landlords also can sort of extract surplus value out of the workers themselves, out of their wages. Some people call this secondary exploitation. And as we'll see, this is a very important part of maintaining finance capitalism and the FIRE sector today, right? Our debts, our mortgage debts, credit card debts, our student loan debts, our car debts, feed these banks, which then are able to loan out money to investors to buy stocks and bonds and inflate the values of those things. So the inflation of stock values, the inflation of bond values, the inflation of real estate values is in many ways fed by our debts. The interest that we pay on our debts is what is sort of fueling all this asset inflation, as well as being diverted from productive investment in the economy as well, to the point that it's now become basically the dominant form of economic activity in the United States, and is essentially what is keeping the economy going. That and a handful of tech monopolies, who also they are producing things, but their value of these companies is also drastically inflated by this as well, by literally people borrowing money to then buy stocks, and that then inflates the value of these stocks, and that's also basically what's keeping the stock market up as well. All these people who love Trump, the first thing they always like to talk about is how great the stock market is doing. I find that to be such an odd argument. First of all, I mean, wasn't the stock market doing well under Obama and Biden as well? And it's not a defense of them, but I mean, isn't that just objectively, what actually happened? And these are two guys who came into office during a time of a profound economic crisis as well, and brought the stock market back. Again, I'm not saying that as a compliment to them. I mean, if anything, it shows that they're able to manage the capitalist system as well for the capitalist class as the Republican Party is, at least as good. Um, so I don't understand that argument. The other thing is, I mean, people never seem to question what is actually keeping the stock market going. And it's basically all fueled by debt and speculation, and those things can only go on so long before you have a a crisis, as has happened now, uh, quite a few times in recent history, and each crisis seems to be getting worse than the last one. Especially if you start tracking them from about 2000 forward. There's basically been three uh, major crises over the last 20 years, each one getting sort of worse than the last one. Makes you wonder if the next one coming is going to be even worse than that. A lot of people are feeling that way with the current so-called AI bubble that is going on. Another speculative bubble, propped up by financial speculation, at least this time going into some kind of productive investment into AI. But, the jury is still out whether or not AI is really going to lead to these massive gains in productivity that people are expecting it to. And if it doesn't, then what you're going to see is, people are going to start pulling their investment out, and that is basically going to send the stock market downward. Anyway, I don't want to get too off topic here. So surplus value can be diverted in various different ways, but again, its source is always unpaid labor. It's an important thing to keep in mind. Exploitation remains regardless of how the surplus is divided up. The point of surplus value, the point of profit, is to allow for capitalist accumulation. Profits can be reinvested. They aren't always, but they can be. New means of production expand capital's power. This increases workers' dependence on capital. Accumulation deepens exploitation. So what happens is you get sort of locked into what people would call a kind of feedback loop, or maybe some people call a kind of vicious cycle, right? Workers create surplus value. This is converted into profits. Capitalists take the profits, reinvest it, expand their productive power even more, which only increases the dependence of workers on capital even more. And so they become even more exploited over time. And then the cycle continues. And it becomes very much a sort of self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating process as well. However, Marx is at pains to remind us that capital is not simply just a social, is not simply just a thing, but it is a social relationship as well. Capital is not just a stock of money that we throw around into investment opportunities. It is, as he says, past labor commanding present labor, right? Capital, the money that capitalists have, only comes through the labor performed in the past, essentially. The value of which is sort of converted into money. So it's basically past labor commanding present labor. It is also, of course, a social relation of domination as well. It stems from the fact that workers don't control anything and don't own any property that can be used to create value. So they're forced to work for somebody else and create value for them. Now, again, going back to this idea of how capitalism can exist even in so-called socialist countries, the key question is to ask yourself, well, are workers in control of production in those countries? Are they in control of production in China, for example? Are they in control of production, which, China has markets too? Are they in control of production in the Soviet Union, which largely abolished markets, although even then existed to some extent or another, and even then, again, like I said, the Soviet Union had to exist in the world economy as well. But the crucial question of whether or not workers were in control of the means of production in those countries, obviously not. So that's one of the strongest arguments that you can make, that those countries actually are capitalist countries, even though they use a kind of socialist rhetoric to conceal that. Workers are not in control of the means of production. Workers are existing in the kind of social relationship that allows for capital. So they are capitalists. In other words, the workers are separated from the means of production, that they are existing in a kind of capitalist relationship. And if that relationship exists in quote unquote socialist countries, then those countries are actually capitalist. But again, people debate these things, but that's certainly one argument that you can make. This leads to fetishism at a higher level. Capital appears as the source of wealth. Employers appear as job creators. Living labor is obscured, when in reality, of course, it is the labor that creates value, and capital is only able to grow by appropriating that labor. Now, I've never heard this, or I don't know for sure if this is confirmed, but I have heard this before, that the novelist Bram Stoker, when he wrote the novel Dracula, that he was a socialist, that he was in some sense inspired. And Marx does talk about, vampires and things like that, like sucking the blood of the workers and things like that. I've heard it said that Bram Stoker was inspired by this to write the novel Dracula. I've never actually confirmed that or not, but I have heard that on at least one occasion. And I mention that here because that's very much kind of the relationship. And again, Marx does reference things like that in his text as well. The capitals are essentially sucking the blood out of the workers. They're sucking their energy, their ability to create value through their exercise of their bodies, basically, and sort of draining that away from the workers and sort of sustaining themselves on that, essentially. Now, how do you create more surplus value? How do you raise the level of surplus value? Capitalists can increase surplus value relative to wages in two basic ways. You have absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. Absolute surplus value, this is somewhat longer here, but the concept behind it is fairly simple. You lengthen the workday. So if you have a 10-hour workday, and the worker equals their wages in 4 hours of labor, you get 6 hours of surplus labor in a 10-hour day. If you lengthen the workday to 12 hours, you get 8 hours of surplus labor and more surplus value. It's a very direct, obvious way in which you can raise the rate of surplus value. This was very widespread in the early phase of industrial capitalism. Marx documents it extensively in Capital, but it has limits, right? You can only lengthen the workday so far. Workers tend to resist that more. So eventually, workers start to fight for longer work days. It may seem funny to think of it, but I mean, the 8-hour workday was literally a revolutionary demand at one point, even into the 20th century. The Bolsheviks in Russia were still asking, prior to the revolution there, we're still asking for an 8-hour workday. From our modern standpoint, it probably still seems like it's too long, right? But compared to a 12-hour workday, a 15-hour workday, it's obviously a lot shorter. And it's worth pointing out that workers had to fight very hard, even at the expense of their lives in some cases, to get an 8-hour workday. Just something to keep in mind. So absolute surplus value may not be as important now, although, once again, you still see it, particularly in sectors of the economy dominated by migrant labor, which are easier to exploit, and sectors of the economy where, production has mostly been outsourced, obviously, as well. But Marx pays much more attention to, or feels that in at the time he's writing, that what he calls relative surplus value is sort of becoming the more important concept. So what this is to increase surplus without lengthening the working day. It's achieved by reducing the proportion of labor time needed to reproduce labor power. Focus shifts from hours worked to productivity per labor. So now you can keep the 10-hour workday, but you can raise the level of surplus value even within those 10 hours. So how do you do that? Harman outlines three main ways, right? One is technological change in production, uh, introducing machinery into the production process means that the worker can work faster, can create more stuff, can create more value in an hour, reduces time needed to produce value equal to wages. So, for example, previously, if it took a worker 4 hours to produce their wages, produce enough value that equals their wages, but with the introduction of technology, now they can produce that value in 2 hours. The amount of value they produce in an hour increases. So now they can do in 2 hours, produce enough value that equals their wages in 2 hours instead of 4 hours. So they still work a 10-hour day, but now they're, again, performing 8 hours of surplus labor, not 6 hours. However, this only has a temporary advantage. Once the technology spreads, socially necessary labor time falls, the commodity values fall, extra surplus uh, disappear. So it only gives sort of a short-term boost to people who are sort of early adopters of technology. As time goes on, the sort of extra advantage that they gain from it tends to go away. What Marx probably pays most attention to is sort of cheapening the worker's means of subsistence. So in other words, the capitalist has to, or it takes 4 hours for a worker to equal their wages based upon how much it costs, essentially to feed and clothe that worker. Well, what if you can cheapen the cost of food and shelter? Then you can pay the worker even less money, but they're not really sort of losing out on it. So again, and of course, if you look at trade conflicts throughout the 19th century, especially in England, where Marx was mostly focused on, for the most part, there's a tremendous conflict between different sections of the British ruling class to introduce free trade, which would cheapen the cost of food. There was a conflict between the capitalists and between the landowners. The capitalists won, they got what they wanted, a reduced price for food, which means that they could basically pay their workers without cutting their real wages. And in other words, not cutting. They could cut the amount of money that they're paying to the worker, but they could pay the worker less, and the worker could still buy the same amount of food, basically. And again, does not have to extend the working day as well. You can also intensify labor. Workers are made to work harder in the same time. This time, well, we're not going to give you extra technology to work with, which is going to speed things up. We're just going to make you work harder and produce more things during the same amount of time. So you increase the intensity of labor, eliminating pauses and slack time. This is an important thing to understand in modern day times as well. I mean, many people describe workers today working harder for the same amount of money, or even less money. Especially since the 1980s, that seems to be something that a lot of people have focused on. So workers are working maybe longer hours, maybe working harder during the same amount of hours, and basically getting the same real wage, the same amount of buying power, being able to buy roughly the same amount of food and other goods, even though they're working much harder for it. Well, this takes a significant toll, obviously, on the workers as well. So during the 1890s, the idea of scientific management was developed by a guy named Frederick Taylor. And he broke down work into time components to sort of, maximize the efficiency of movements, how a worker would have to move to produce things fast. He claimed he could increase productivity by up to 200%. Of course, the worker is subject to even more control. I've already talked about this in a previous class about the increasing surveillance and monitoring of workers, whether it's people working at home, UPS drivers, Amazon drivers, people working in supermarkets and things like that. There's constant surveillance of these workers. Not just Amazon drivers, Amazon, people working in the warehouses as well, surveilling these people to eliminate any kind of wasted movement and to make sure that they're more or less constantly working. I mean, that's very much in this falls under this rubric as well. Then you have the development of the assembly line. I'm going to start to speed things up a little bit faster because I know I've been talking for a while now. So commodity production implies competition between producers. Again, this is somewhat changed if you have sort of one state government more or less, controlling things, but this is sort of the typical way in which capitalism works. Even in a system controlled by the state, you might still have competition between different firms, between different factories that exist, trying to outdo each other basically. Competition links, and of course there are production quotas and things like that that have to be met. Competition links producers indirectly through exchange, according to Engels, who worked with Marx, social production, but capitalist appropriation. So again, it's a social process, right? The system only works when you have people, in a sense, working in a cooperative way. Not even people in the same business, but throughout society as well, right? We are all cooperating with each other in creating the food that we eat and building the cars that we drive and building the homes that we live in and making the clothes that we wear and so on and so forth. You can obviously add more examples to that. So there is a sort of social cooperation that is necessary for those things, but it's all sort of privately owned and directed at the same time. And this introduces another contradiction, a tension between these things, that there are sort of internal tensions in the capitalist system that do not sort of resolve themselves. And this is one of these examples. We cooperate socially to produce things, but the benefits of this cooperation are not enjoyed by us, but are basically appropriated by the people at the very top. Again, billions of people, arguably, to some extent or another, if you look at a worldwide scale, but the benefits of that cooperation are all appropriated by 10,000 people or something like that. Capitalist firms must compete or go out of business. Firms are under pressure to improve their productivity as well. Falling behind means you go bankrupt. Investment in new machinery, of course, requires high profits as well. If one firm raises exploitation to invest, others must follow. No capitalist can afford to stand still. There's a compulsion to accumulate as well. Capitalism becomes a system of exploitation of wage labor, relentless accumulation. Capitalists are compelled to expand value. Accumulation becomes an end in itself. Now, here again, I mean, not to keep belaboring this point, but you see that in the Soviet Union, in China as well. There's accumulation going on, right? We need to produce more things, use that to expand our ability to produce even more. And in some ways, we're even more relentless in their drive to sort of catch up to the Western countries, which obviously had a large head start on them. Accumulation for accumulation's sake, production for production's sake. Again, not thinking of the social goals, the social welfare of people, just making more things to expand more, to produce more. Again, you can make a pretty good argument that the Soviet Union was even more guilty of that than even some of the so-called Western countries were, for example. Capitalism is not defined by exploitation alone. Exploitation existed in earlier societies. Capitalism is defined by exploitation plus competitive accumulation. Here he gives somewhat of a definition of capitalism. Again, exploiting workers who do not own anything, do not own any property of themselves, and then using the value that they create to expand the system even more. That is somewhat distinct from the more sort of static systems of slavery and feudalism, right, which were not defined by constant accumulation, constant expansion. Yes, they exploited workers, but they were more or less content to sort of keep things where they were. They didn't feel this constant pressure to sort of expand and expand. Capitalists themselves face constraints as well. They can choose how to exploit workers. They cannot choose not to exploit them. Exploitation is built into the system, whether or not you're a so-called good capitalist or not, a virtuous person or not. You are still subject to the laws of competition. And if you do not abide by those laws, you risk going out of business yourself, right? So capitalists themselves are also dominated by the system as well. And the system itself comes on to, again, sort of take on a life of its own. It's independent of the individual intentions of people. Only human labor creates new value. Nature provides use value, but labor adds value to them. Machines are, again, products of past human labor, so they sort of embody that labor in them. But Marx is that, again, at pains to explain that people that machines basically do not create new value themselves. They can only pass on the value they already contain within them. Only human labor or labor power can create new value. I'm going to move on a little bit faster here. This is an important thing to go over, though. Constant and variable capital. So capital investment can be broken down into two parts. So say capital invests $1,000, but what are they investing in? Many capitalists don't see, a point necessarily in, or from a theoretical point of view, don't see a point in breaking it down any more than that. But Marx argues that how that money is invested crucially determines the profits which the capitalists will be able to get out of the production process. So variable capital, V, are the wages paid to workers, purchases labor power, expands value, and produces surplus value. Constant capital is C. That's the means of production, machines, materials, basically, does not create new value. So investment can be seen as, C plus V, but the ratio of C and V matters a lot. So let's say a capitalist invests $1,000. What ratio of that is being spent on V and what ratio of that is being spent on C? How much is being spent on V and C determines how much profit a capitalist will be able to make. If they're spending most of it on C, they're not going to make much of a profit. They may recreate their initial investment, but they're not going to create much extra beyond that. To create extra value, they have to invest more in V, basically, in variable capital. So this leads to various, formulas that Marx begins to introduce. Surplus value, which is S. So you have C, V, S. Surplus value is created by labor beyond what is necessary to reduce labor power. Marx says that there is a rate of exploitation, also known as the rate of surplus value, S divided by V. So how much surplus value is being created relative to in ratio to the wages paid to the worker. If the workers are getting very high wages, typically, then the surplus value that they're getting out of those workers are going to be very relatively low. So, of course, that creates a constant pressure on the capitalists to lower V and increase S, right? They want to get as much surplus value out of the workers that they can get. Of course, the workers are trying to do the opposite. The rate of profit, he says, comes out of this as well. So you have S divided by V. Now you have S divided by C plus V. So now you include not just the wages paid to workers, but the total capital investment. And what's left, basically, after you account for constant capital costs and variable capital costs, is your surplus value. Now, the rate of profit and the rate of surplus value are represented as a percentage. So you might have, let's say a 20% profit rate or something like that after you deduct for your costs, your constant capital and variable capital costs. Then you have another concept known as the organic composition of capital. And this is another complicated thing. Harman kind of simplifies it a little bit here. I'm not going to go too much into it, though, because it's getting too long to explain all this stuff. But basically, I kind of already alluded to it a moment ago, the ratio of constant capital to variable capital. You also have to keep in mind the actual, quantity of machines basically versus the actual quantity of workers and how many hours those workers are working. But let's keep it somewhat simple here. So C divided by V. Again, if C is increasing faster than V, it's going to affect your profit rate, right? Because C is not creating surplus value. Only workers are. And again, if um, capitalists are not just paying um, workers higher, or capitalists need to employ more workers to create more surplus value, which would mean usually an increase in V. But what Marx argues basically is that over time, there's more of a tendency to replace workers with machines. So that leads to constant capital costs increasing relative to variable capital costs. As you lay off more and more workers, your wage cost decreases, but your constant capital costs increase as well, which is going to negatively affect your profit rate. Based on this ratio, you could talk about so-called capital-intensive industries. You could talk about labor-intensive industries. Now, there's a very interesting thing that happens here. But basically, labor-intensive industries, again, you'll see a lot of these in the global south as well, produce more surplus value. However, because of the competition that exists between different sectors of capitalism, what happens, and this is a complicated process, so I'm going to have to get away with giving a very short explanation of this, but what happens basically is that capitalists in the more low profit, capital intensive sectors, low surplus value producing capital intensive sectors, are able to kind of take away some of the value produced by the labor intensive sectors. So the good example would be the United States and China. We always talk about the trade deficit between the United States and China. However, because China produces so much surplus value, or it has historically in recent times produced so much surplus value in labor intensive industry, capitalists in the United States are able to take a lot of that surplus value produced in China and keep it for themselves, essentially to appropriate it for themselves. And that happens in spite of the trade deficit. The trade deficit only kind of gives you sort of a superficial understanding of what's going on. Underneath that dynamic, there's a sort of deeper, sort of hidden dynamic of surplus value basically flowing out of China and into the United States. Again, the exact mechanics of how that work can be somewhat complicated to explain, but basically has a lot to do with how prices adjust value. So essentially what happens is that Chinese produced goods are sold below value, and U.S. Produced goods, the U.S. still does export a lot, are priced above their value. So because the U.S. gets to price above their value and China has to produce price below their value, that is equivalent to the United States capitalists basically taking surplus value out of China. Very important thing to understand, again, for international trade. So, of course, capitalism is about increasing surplus value, maintaining or raising the rate of profit. I won't really address criticisms of Marx, but I mean, one thing that really stands out is that Marx basically says that capitalism is all about, like the profit rate, basically, whereas non-Marxist economists will say that the economy is really about satisfying consumer needs, and profit takes sort of like a secondary role. Like profit's sort of like a reward that you get, I guess, for satisfying consumer needs. Now, I would ask people just, at first glance, I mean, what sounds more realistic to you? Is the economy dominated by the profit motive, or is it not? I mean, to me, that's one argument why Marx's account sounds much more realistic. Basically, the economy is about making a profit and maximizing that profit, satisfying consumer needs. That's what becomes the secondary goal. Profit is primary, satisfying needs is secondary. Mainstream economics will reverse that relationship and tell you that satisfying needs is the primary thing and profit is a secondary thing. Which one sounds more realistic to you? Leave that up to you to decide. Primitive accumulation here now again. If you're wondering what does this has to do with the American government, I tried to explain it way at the beginning of the video. But here, unfortunately, is another thing which the U.S. has in common. Marx talks about what were sort of the conditions that led to capitalism taking shape. He refers to this as primitive accumulation. Wage labor at this point is fairly rare. Most people had some access to means of livelihood. Exploitation existed, of course, but not generalized wage labor, meaning that wage labor not become sort of the norm throughout uh, society. So for capitalism to take off, you have to first separate workers from the means of production. Capitalism required the mass dispossession of producers. So people who used to, work their own land, or small, craftsmen that would, make their own things, had to essentially be separated from those things and become propertyless wage laborers. And you could argue this still takes place today. Again, another Marxist theorist, David Harvey, argues that this is now sort of the primary means of capitalist accumulation in the global South, although I think the sort of more regular dynamics of capitalist exploitation probably play a greater role. But Harvey's point, I think he's correct to point out, is that primitive accumulation isn't just something that happened in the past. It still plays out even in the present day as well. How dominant it is, how primary it is a debatable point, but it certainly still goes on. So Harman gives various examples of how people were driven off their land, essentially converted into propertyless wage laborers, thrown off their land, forced to migrate into the cities, looking for work. Basically, vagrancy laws basically forced people into becoming wage laborers. Actually, by the way, you see this in the post Civil War South, where many freed slaves, because they did not own any property, were forced to go to work, in many cases for their former slave owners, under similar laws passed like that. And of course, slavery was a big part of the development of capitalism as well, right? It involved plunder through colonial possessions, through the slave trade, through using slave labor, which could be seen as sort of two different things. Using slaves as a tradable commodity on the one hand, versus using slaves as a means of producing goods on the other hand. Obviously, both are related to each other, and again, unfortunately, you can't avoid the direct parallels between things like this, and then consider the history of the United States as well. So again, these things are coming into being at the same time. The United States is coming into being at around the same time. You can't pinpoint it exactly, of course, but around the same time in which the capitalist system is coming into being as well. Marx described this as the rosy dawn of capitalism. Obviously, he means that in an ironic sense. Again, it's not just colonial plunder. However, again, it was key that you had to that you had to also create a pool of wage labor that you could draw from as well. Otherwise, if you didn't have wage labor, you wouldn't have this capitalist accumulation that would become this sort of self-expanding system as well. All right, tiring myself out here. Again, it's a self-expanding system, like I already said. Now, I'm going to flash this on the screen. I'm going to move through this really quick. That was all, by the way, just chapter 1. Chapter 2, Harman addresses some of Marx's critics. You can see it there. Obviously, you can't talk about Marx without talking about criticisms of Marx, given all the people who are saying that Marx is out of date, or he's wrong, or whatever. So you can judge for yourself if you want to read it. It is included in the PowerPoint. I'd be happy to discuss this with people too, outside of class as well. Pretty long, but I'm going to basically skip it. He does talk a little bit more about how this, how values are adjusted into prices, which is a very important thing. I'm going to basically skip over this. Again, very important to understand, especially for international trade today, but also, within a capitalist system as well, of course. I spent most of my time talking about chapter 1. I'm going to have a very short overview of chapter 3. Talk a little bit about finance capitalism, and then move on to talking about the introductions to talking about the Constitution, which I'll then mostly pick up in the next class. So, capitalism develops through booms and crises as well. Crises are systemic, not accidental. So, a crisis is internal to the capitalist system. It is a part of the normal functioning of a capitalist system, not something external. Again, capitalism does not grow in a smooth process. It goes through various booms and busts, which Marx understood. He didn't say that capitalism is just a straight line down and everything's constantly getting worse. Probably more accurately, Marx would describe capitalism as a volatile system. Yes, there are periods of prosperity. Those periods of prosperity are followed by periods of economic depression as well. And there seems to also be an indication that the boom times get shorter and shorter, and the bust periods get longer and longer and get more severe as well. And that does seem to be something that can be empirically observable as well. Of course, in the early part of the 20th century, many people thought that the 1930s, that the Great Depression was sort of the culmination of this. Many people thought that this was it. This was like the end of capitalism, which Marx never actually seemed to say. That seems to be another debate that people have. Did Marx say that capitalism was going to crash completely in some sort of final apocalyptic crisis one day? Many Marxists of the early 20th century seem to think that is what Marx thought. Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, various other people seem to hold that view to some extent or another. However, more modern scholarship seems to indicate more what I just said is more accurately to characterize Marx's view as this sort of endless cycle of volatility, basically. Although with the caveat that again, it's not a static thing either. The good periods seem to get shorter and shorter, and the bad periods seem to get longer and longer, which maybe still sort of opens the way to assuming that there would be a kind of final crash, but it's a little hard to discern exactly the logic of that or what we're supposed to take away from that. Anyway, crises are a regular part of the capitalist system. Again, they are not an accident. They're not created by governments doing stupid things. They're not created by greedy people either. A lot of people seem to think that capitalism is just all about greed, and that bad things happen when people, act out of their greed. This is what people like Elizabeth Warren say, for example, right? Elizabeth Warren's a capitalist, and she's supposed to be considered, left in the very sort of low standard of American politics for understanding capitalism. But her approach is basically, yeah, she wants to, get rid of the so-called bad capitalists and replace them with good capitalists. But that seems to be entirely missing the point. I mean, that's not what the problem is. The problem isn't just people doing greedy things. I mean, those things do happen, of course, but that's not ultimately, in the final analysis, the biggest problem. The biggest problem is just how the system itself is set up to function. So again, of course, mainstream theory tends to dismiss that. They think that the crisis comes from some sort of external thing happening, not something intrinsic to the capitalist system itself. Earlier theorists thought that crises wouldn't happen in a capitalist system, that there would never be a problem because you would always find people to buy the output produced by the capitalist. That's obviously not true. A lot of people point to the fact that a crisis happens in capitalism because workers become so poor that they can't buy everything produced by the capitalists as well. This is what a lot of economic theorists say, who are somewhat critical of capitalism, but not necessarily Marxists. This is often referred to as the underconsumption argument, and this is also shared to a large extent by many Marxist economists as well. Harman seems to treat it as a problem, but he's correct. Following Marx, I mean, Marx did not, in fact, think that was necessarily the biggest problem in a capitalist system. It's not wages are too low to buy back what is produced. That is true, but that's more a symptom of the disease, I guess you could say, rather than the source itself. The real problem is that, again, the productivity of the system tends to undermine its profitability. New technology raises output, reduces labor per product. But labor is a source of profit, so profit rates tend to fall. Capitalism undermines its own profit base. So there's a tendency for the rate of profit to fall in the economy. A crisis can temporarily fix the system, but you have to sort of allow the crisis to sort of run its course. What has happened basically also over the last several uh, decades is that governments have stepped in to prevent the crisis from sort of fully running its course, which is an interesting argument because what they're saying is that they're only sort of delaying the inevitable in a lot of ways. So government stepped in after the so-called dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s, but arguably that made the 2008 crash worse. Government stepped in to deal with that, which made the 2020 crash even worse because of COVID, of course, but really because of the supply chain um, bottlenecks that built up because of that, and also because of the underlying weakness of the economy as well. That's a whole other argument. I'm sorry, there's so many unresolved arguments here, but some Marxists argue that the falling rate of profit is not the most important thing, or is not applicable in many circumstances. I think the best response to that are by people like Andrew Kleiman and Alan Freeman, who are Marxist economists, that argue that the falling rate of profit is an underlying factor. It creates the weakness in the economy. And when something else happens, like the housing market crashing in 2008 or COVID happening in 2020, that it sort of exposes the underlying weakness in the economy. That those crashes would not have been as bad as they were if the economy wasn't already sort of weakened because of a low rate of profit. And of course, credit plays a role in this as well. Banks being able to loan out money to capitalists to sort of keep them going for a while, to substitute for investment out of profit and things like that. Now will turn briefly to the idea of finance capitalism. That's more or less the summary of Harman's book, of the first 3 chapters of Harman's book, really chapters 1 and chapter 3. But many people would argue that the system of industrial capitalism has given way to a system of finance capitalism, where finance is now the dominant activity. Some would say that this actually fundamentally changes the laws that Marx analyzed in Capital. But once again, I don't think that's necessarily the case, and that the move to finance capitalism is a result of the falling rate of profit in industry, which has been evident since the 1970s. That profits made through production, through factories and things like that have fallen to low levels, and in response, capitalists have taken money out of industry and put them into financial speculation. That seems to be fairly obviously true. Everyone's pretty much aware of the fact that manufacturing jobs have basically mostly gone overseas. So I think the modern day system of finance capitalism is still consistent with the kind of framework that Marx outlined. Anyway, I don't have too much, I'm not going to go through a whole big thing trying to explain finance capitalism. I want to just capture one recent episode that I think says a lot about it. So Trump recently held a public dinner with representatives from 5 of the 6 largest U.S.-based multinational technology corporations. The purpose was to pledge to expand their profits. Executives showered him with praise. Trump promised to ease permits for the companies. According to one report, executives thanked him 30 times in 15 minutes. Now, these were all the big tech companies: Google, Microsoft, OpenAI, which makes Chat GPT, which developed Chat GPT. I think Facebook was there, or whatever they call themselves these days. Meta, is that it? Google's Alphabet now. But it's important to keep in mind because these are seemingly productive companies that produce products, but they are very much beneficiaries of the financial speculation, which now dominates the economy. So Microsoft has a $3.6 trillion market cap. So the market cap is basically the shares of a company available multiplied by its stock price. 3.6 trillion. Bill Gates himself is worth over $100 billion. Apple's there, again, Alphabet, Google, Meta, Facebook, whatever it's called. 1.8 trillion market cap. Zuckerberg's wealth, personal wealth, $263 billion. So here's what's important to understand. Now, when we talk about finance, capitalism, obviously you think about banks, buying and selling stocks and bonds and things like that, loaning out money, giving out mortgages or bundling these mortgages into bonds and things like that, as happened in leading up to 2008. But it's important to understand that the technology companies that are producing things are still very much beneficiaries of this also. So even the companies that are making things are incorporated into the system of finance capitalism, and it drastically inflates the value of these companies, right? I mean, so you can sort of strip that away. Companies like Microsoft would obviously, and Apple obviously would still be worth a lot of money. They probably would not be worth as much as they are valued at, if not for this massive, inflation of their stock values. And of course, these guys probably wouldn't be worth, hundreds of billions of dollars either, if not for that. They may be millionaires, but not necessarily billionaires, for example. That's an important thing to keep in mind. The average person, and I would include myself in that, probably doesn't really, I've had to have it explained to me, in other words, probably doesn't really understand the difference between a millionaire and a billionaire. But there is a massive gap between just being a millionaire and a billionaire. And again, most people probably would not be valued at this much without the massive inflation of their stock values, which again comes from banks basically just loaning money to investors to buy stock in these companies, as well as these companies themselves basically buying their own stocks. So a lot of focus is on the so-called Magnificent Seven. These are basically the seven largest tech companies today. They dominate the S&P 500. That's the 500 largest corporations in the United States, making up more than a third of their value of these companies as a whole. 7 companies out of 500 companies make up more than a third of their value. Market cap grew from 1 trillion in 2012, not exactly ancient history here, to almost 20 trillion in 2024. Since Trump's inauguration, market cap rose another 3 trillion. Now, again, market capitalization is directly related to the stock price. It's one of the prime. It is what determines their market cap, as well as the number of shares available of a company. So again, a lot of their wealth comes not through actual productive in investment and actually, just selling goods and services, but through people buying their stock and the inflation of their value. Elon Musk is another perfect example of this. Elon Musk did not become the richest man in the world, richest person in the world, through selling cars. He became the richest man in the world by people buying up Tesla stock. He is a creature of financial speculation, probably more than anyone else. And whatever else you think about him, his prominence in public life now, stems from that as well. But we should also understand what role the government itself, why these executives kissing Trump's ass basically at this public dinner. It's because they want the United States government to continue policies which makes it easier and allows them to inflate their stock values. Even if, again, financial wealth is essentially drained out of the productive sectors of the economy and drained out of the workers as well through their own, like I said, debt payments and things like that. And this is where things get a little more interesting because you could argue, well, isn't Apple and Microsoft, aren't they in the productive sector of the economy? Yes, they are, but they're also draining value produced out of other productive sectors of the economy. So they have one foot in the productive sector, actually producing value, but their value is also grossly exaggerated and distorted through this financial speculation as well. I think an important thing to understand is it's not that there's always just a clear cut separation between a productive company and a speculative company. Productive companies could also be sort of grossly enlarged through speculation as well. But again, the Federal Reserve plays a major role in this, especially after 2008, when they essentially reinflated the asset bubble that the American economy had become. People talk about the period after 2008 as the everything bubble, whereas prior to that, bubbles were concentrated in specific areas. The .com companies, the internet companies in the 1990s, the housing market in 2008. After that, again, directly because of the policies of the U.S. Government, by lowering interest rates basically to zero, which makes it easier to loan out money, by pumping so much money into the financial system. So this process of quantitative easing, where the Federal Reserve basically took bad investments that these banks had made and gave them money in return for it, created an everything bubble where everything became inflated. Stocks, bonds, real estates, cryptocurrency, NFTs, all this stupid shit. Basically, people have been talking about through for the last few years. All these things are a consequence of this, of the government just giving money over to the private sector. I would also ask people, what kind of a free market is that? When you have the government basically just giving money to the private sector and letting them speculate with it. I mean, anyone who talks about the free market this day and that the government should stay out of the private sector, I mean, it's a joke. I mean, the economy could not last without government intervention propping it up, and continues to this very day. Okay. So this allows them to get loans. This allows them to take on more and more debt. If you take on debt at a high interest rate, then, it might cause some hesitation. But the interest rate is like zero, basically. It's essentially what people call free money, right? I mean, you basically just have to pay back what you borrowed. You don't even have to pay any interest on it. So even companies that are profitable, like Apple, for example, take on massive amounts of debt. Why not? It's free money. Why not borrow it? Borrow even more than what we have on hand, basically, in terms of profit, to buy even more stocks, even if it's our own stock, and inflate the value of it. By the way, people like Warren Buffett, the famous investor, have talked about this. They're completely fine with it. He doesn't care that Apple's buying its own stock. What he'll say is that, well, there's no other way for them to invest. There's no other profitable investments for them to make. Now, he doesn't seem to mind that, but shouldn't that make a person take a pause and say, well, there's nothing else that they can invest in? Why is the rest of the economy so unprofitable, other than these handful of tech companies, basically? But I mean, that's the difference between just trying to make money out of investments, rather taking a sort of larger stock of what's going on and sort of looking at more of the long-term picture. So again, many companies buy back their own shares. They because they're getting free money, essentially they speculate more. The global dominance of the dollar. Many people would argue that the true foundation of the American empire on the global stage, which may be retreating back into being a regional empire that just wants to dominate North and South America. But the true foundation of America as an empire isn't necessarily through its military power. It's through the use of the dollar, which is still used, on the global stage, although more and more countries are sort of moving away from it now. But what this does obviously gives the U.S. leverage over countries that use the dollar. You can't buy oil without dollars, for example. But it also allows, because the U.S. can essentially find people that are willing to hold dollars. The United States can keep creating money without inflation. Normally, if a country just massively expands its own money supply, it would face significant inflation, which we've seen recently, of course, but hyper inflation, massive increases in prices. The United States, for decades, I mean, since the 1970s, has been able to do this. We're seeing very little inflation for the most part, outside of a few, episodes, basically, has been able to do this without significant inflation because it's able to find countries that are willing to hold onto its dollars. This is a crucial part of American power that most people probably don't understand. Anyway, it's an unstable system, though, of course, because again, I mean, less countries are now willing to hold it. Dollars. China, for a while, was the largest holder of dollars, which are mostly accumulated through trade with the United States. What do these countries do when they have all these dollars? They give it back to the United States. They essentially loan it back to the United States. But now China is less willing to do that, and for good reason. What's the United States doing? Sending more arms to Taiwan, building up its own naval presence in the Pacific region of the world. Essentially, China's been paying the United States government to do this. So they realized that. They're like, well, we're not going to do this anymore. And so they've been gradually, dumping their assets, their dollar assets. But if the United States can find other countries that are willing to do it, then it can keep this going for a while. The point, though, is that the system may still be functioning now, but it's increasingly becoming an unstable system. Let me show you this here. Let me switch screens for a second. Oh, happened. I took too long to do this, I guess. I had this thing open, the profit rate. These economists at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Wasner and Basu, calculate the Marxist rate of profit. Now, there's different ways in calculating it. The approach that I follows, again, economists like Andrew Kleiman. We use something called historical costs, although that's somewhat different than what he talks about, but I guess somewhat similar to it. Anyway, you can see the profit rate from 1945 to 2025, and you can see the long term it has been declining. Though you see these sort of cycles of prosperity followed by depression. You see basically where we are now. You see the periods since 2000 of extreme speculative activity, sort of followed by a massive economic crash. This is leading up to the crash in 2008. You can see the attempts to create the everything bubble. You can see the AI bubble here, manifesting after 2020. But and you can see it's raised the profit rate. This is including financial speculation as well, including profits from financial enterprises, which are basically keeping the profit rate up for the most part. But you can see it's starting to trend downwards again. So it confirms the idea of sort of long-term instability in the capital system. You can see that the economy is overall doing much worse than it was, coming out of World War II. And there's no real way that it'll probably ever get it up to that level again. I mean, that's just basically never going to happen. All right. Where is my PowerPoint? And of course, the U.S. is, dealing with more and more competition from China now as well. All those Magnificent Seven companies that I mentioned a moment ago. I mean, is now basically a Chinese competitor to all, to Apple, to Facebook, social media, to Amazon. I actually used the Chinese version of Amazon over this past Christmas season to get some Christmas gifts. Work pretty well. I mean, at least as good as Amazon. So there's greater fear that as Chinese companies begin to compete with American companies, not just in terms of textiles and things like that, but actually competing in these capital intensive industries as well, that's going to have a negative effect on profits in the United States. And I think that's a big part of the reason why you see increased tensions between the United States and China as well. I literally wrote a book on this topic that will be coming out soon, by the way. Anyway, so I will try to briefly run through at least some introductory comments to the Declaration and the Constitution. Hopefully, you're able to hang in there. For now, you should probably watch this maybe in smaller clips or something like that, because I know I can talk for a while. But anyway, first of all, how do we understand the Declaration and the Constitution? Well, these are obviously our most important foundational documents. Many people argue, of course, they are in harmony with each other, that the values and views expressed in one are completely in sync with the values and views expressed in the other. Many people, however, see that there's a tension between the two. That the political philosophy, if you will, of the Declaration of Independence is much more revolutionary than the political philosophy in the Constitution, was much more conservative. I think that's true. I don't think these things are necessarily in harmony with each other. After all, if you read the famous opening of the Declaration of Independence, what G.K. Chesterton, by the way, calls the Creed of America, which we talked about last class, it's quite clear, besides the stuff about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what John Locke, the political thinker, called life, liberty, and property, which is interesting. It says quite clearly that, if the government does not deliver these rights to people, if the government does not deliver a justice to people, the right of people to alter or to abolish the government. It says it right there. Now, how many people think that the government today is just? How many think people feel that we live in a just society? Which you could say many things about what does that mean? But in some sense that people sort of get what they deserve in life, things like that. I mean, do we really see that in evidence today? If not, then it's saying quite here that we should be trying to, alter or even to abolish the government and to create a new one or to create something else. Now, we know despite all the talk about all men created equal and things like that, the reality of life in the early American Republic, and still to this day, fell very short of it, though much more so back then. Women, of course, did not have the right to vote. African Americans, whether they were slaves or not slaves, were not allowed to vote. And Native Americans were not allowed to vote either. Charles A. Beard wrote a book called The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States in 1913. For many years, this was the definitive interpretation of the Constitution. It kind of fell out of favor during the Cold War. I think there were Cold War considerations that maybe led to that, because as you'll see, Beard offers almost like kind of again sort of a Marxist account of the Constitution, and it's interesting. This was accepted by the mainstream, from this period of time, basically up until the Cold War. Beard argues unambiguously that the Constitution was motivated by the economic interests of the founders. That what they wanted to do was to create a system of government where they would have the wealthy property owners in both the North and South would have the preponderance of political power. People forget that, George Washington, for example, is not just the father of the country. He was also the richest guy in the United States. He was the Elon Musk of the 1770s and the 1780s. He was he wasn't the wealthiest man in the world, but he was the wealthiest man in the United States at that point in time. He was a landowner, he was a slave owner, and he had many financial interests as well. He basically functioned as a bank. He had so much money, he could essentially loan out money to other people and collect interest on it. Alexander Hamilton, who worked closely with Washington, of course, became the first Secretary of the Treasury, helped Wall Street speculators make money off the government debt. I'll maybe try to explain that a little bit more. Next class, I'm drastically running out of gas right now. I've been talking for a very long time, but that's an interesting story as well. Kind of show you this kind of Wall Street speculation also is basically, you know, uh, existed at the genesis of the American government as well. They were worried by uprisings from working class people of that time over their debts, over Revolutionary War veterans who were, literally risked their lives gaining their freedom uh, from the British, and now saw that their situation afterwards wasn't really that much improved upon. So you have Shays' Rebellion, for example, where another close aide to Washington, Henry Knox, wrote that these people think that property should be the common property of all. Imagine such a crazy idea. And this was also, beaten down with force also. They sent in troops. This is prior to the Constitution, but many people would argue that Shays' Rebellion was one of the um, um, catalysts which led to the Constitution. I'm kind of skipping over the Articles of Confederation and things like that, which existed after the American Revolution for a number of years. But the point is that the Constitution was created to create, first of all, a stronger government than many people realize, stronger government than what existed in the early Articles of Confederation, but also to create a government that would make sure the political power stayed in the hands of the wealthy. And to do so, created a fairly undemocratic system of government as well. We talk about the Electoral College, which we'll talk more about. Of course, you have things like the 3/5 compromise as well. You have various concessions made to slave interests at that time. You had a slave owning interest in the South. You had commercial interests in the North, traders, shippers. You didn't have much industry at that point in time. Industry would come, in the decades following for the most part. Again, this is a very sort of early phase of the development of capitalism. Still, in many ways, during the phase of so-called primitive accumulation, as Marx calls it. But industry would later, of course, take root in the North as well. But even if the northern and southern interest had different interests and had different sources of accumulating wealth, whether through trade or through slavery, through slave labor and plantations, what they had in common, at least, is that they were pretty sure that they wanted to, at least divide the power among themselves and not have to split the power with the propertyless, workers and farmers that existed in the United States as well. Now, I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind because it speaks a lot to how functional the government is. Many people feel that the American government has become dysfunctional now. That's not able to do what people think it's supposed to do. But I would argue if the American government was created with the intention of making sure that most political power stayed in the hands of the wealthy, that they would be able to essentially block laws from being passed that would, upset their economic interests, then the American government is extremely functional, right? It's doing what it's supposed to be doing, not that it's breaking down. It is actually accomplishing the goals that it was created to do, basically. We'll pick that up next class. I'm going to wrap things up here. Okay, take care, everyone.